My talk is about Émilie du Châtelet on certainty in knowledge, a priori principles, and a posteriori experience, the two criteria of higher probability and hypotheses. My main thesis in this talk is that du Châtelet recognized two sources of certainty in knowledge, a priori principles on the one hand, and a posteriori sensory experience on the other. Human knowledge becomes uncertain and probabilistic whenever the immediate demonstration through a priori principles or immediate validation through a posteriori observation is not possible. In the following, I will show that there are two forms of certainty in knowledge in du Châtelet. Certain knowledge of self-evident a priori principles and certain knowledge through sensory experience. A priori principles and a posteriori experience in turn are the guiding criteria for a higher degree of probability of hypotheses. So my first point is the first source of certain knowledge, the a priori principles. To du Châtelet, all our cognitions are founded on principles which are self-evidently true. She writes, all our cognitions are born from each other and are founded on certain principles whose truth is known without even reflecting on them because they are self-evident, end of quote. In du Châtelet's argument, the principle of contradiction, henceforth PC, is certain because it is an a priori condition and principle of truth. Du Châtelet likens the denial of the PC to a lie to our conscience because the PC is a condition for the cognition of all beings, as I have shown elsewhere. As a result of the fact that du Châtelet uncovers the PC as a condition of any truth, the PC itself, as an object of metaphysical knowledge, is true with certainty, and this is self-evident. The same is the case for the principle of sufficient reason, which is known with certainty because it is a condition for our cognition of the real world and for our ability to distinguish the real world from our dreams, imaginings, and fantasies. She writes, I quote, I dream that I'm in my room, busy writing. All of a sudden, my chair changes into a winged horse, and I find myself in an instant 100 leagues from the place where I was, with people who have been dead for a long time, etc. All of this cannot happen in this world, since there would be no sufficient reason for all these effects. For when I leave my room, I can say how and why I leave it, and I do not go from one place to another without passing through intermediary places. Yet all these chimeras would be equally possible if effects could exist without sufficient reason. It is this principle that distinguishes dreaming from waking and the real world from the fabulous world that is depicted in fairy tales. Thus, those who deny the principle of sufficient reason are the inhabitants of a fabulous world that does not exist, but in the real world, all must happen according to this principle. The PSR, she argues here, is the premise for my knowledge of the real world and cannot be denied without thereby becoming the inhabitant of a fabulous world that does not exist. The PSR is known with certainty as an object of a metaphysical investigation because it is uncovered as the condition of our cognition of the real world. Knowledge of the first principles of our cognitions is termed metaphysical knowledge by du Châtelet. Du Châtelet wishes to delineate metaphysical knowledge of the axiomatic principles and fundamental concepts of our cognition in the first few chapters in order to provide a clear and unassailable view of the truths. End of quote. This metaphysical knowledge is certain and self-evidently true, according to du Châtelet. I'm coming to the second section. Certainty and uncertainty in knowledge that is a consequence of the first principles. While, as we have seen, it is clear that du Châtelet, that knowledge of the first principles of knowledge themselves is certain in du Châtelet, it is more ambiguous if and in what sense the certainty in our knowledge of the principles extends to other knowledge based on said principles. Some passages in Du Châtelet suggest that the principles give rise to certainty in this other knowledge, insofar as it is immediately or evidently in accordance with them. She writes, I quote, "Some truths immediately depend on these first principles and are derived from them as a result of a small number of conclusions only. In that case, the mind easily perceives the sequence that has led to them, but it is easy to lose sight of this sequence in the search for truths that can only be reached by a great number of conclusions drawn one from another," end of quote. Du Châtelet indicates that the first principles establish a form for truths which is easy to grasp if a conclusion is immediately based on the first principle in question, while this form, which the principle itself establishes, can be overlooked in more complex conclusions. If the form is overlooked, the conclusion is not certain because we do not know with clarity whether it violates either of the certain principles of knowledge or not. So, for example, 2 + 2 is 4 and not unequal 4 is easy to know because it is immediately based on the PC, while 640 - 18 is 622 and not unequal 311 + 311 is more difficult to know because we have to consider how these numbers relate to the PC. However, my certainty, even in the first example, so the 2 + 2 is 4 example, seems to depend on, firstly, the PC, but also, and importantly, secondly, on my ability in mathematics. My 5-year-old may not be as convinced as I am. On the contrary, the certainty in my knowledge of the PC itself is only dependent on the recognition of the PC as a principle of knowledge itself. Thus, in knowledge that depends on the first principles, but is not knowledge of the principles themselves, my certainty is of a different type. This is because knowledge that depends on the first principles is dependent on 3 conditions. Firstly, the validity of the first principle itself, which is indubitable, according to Du Châtelet. Secondly, certainty that the conclusion is in line with the principle on which it is based. So 2 + 2 is 4 and not 2 + 2 is 5. And 3, certainty that I have not made a mistake with a view to the content of whatever the conclusion is about. So 2 apples and 2 pears are not 4 apples. According to Du Châtelet, condition 1 for certainty in knowledge is given. So the condition that I know of the validity of the PC and the PSR. But condition 2 and condition 3 are tasks that have been for the human being, that are set for the human being. We must strive to demonstrate the congruence of our conclusions with the first principles. However, with a view to the content of our conclusions, it can be difficult to establish whether they are in line with the principles or not. Demonstrations and verifications, namely, are prone to error. We will come back to this later. So I'm getting to my third point, the second source of certain knowledge in Du Châtelet, a posteriori experience. We saw above that knowledge of the first principles of knowledge is certain to Du Châtelet. As Brading, Detlefsen, and Paganini highlight, we must acknowledge a second prong of Du Châtelet's metaphysics alongside her a priori principles, namely that sensory experience is a form of knowledge. Du Châtelet writes, for example, I quote, "So it is absolutely necessary in order to preserve oneself from error, to verify one's ideas, to demonstrate their reality, and not to admit any as incontestable unless confirmed by experience or unless confirmed by experience or by demonstration, which includes nothing false or chimerical." End of quote. Experience, according to Du Châtelet, is a confirmation of the truth or reality of our ideas, similarly to demonstration. But what is experience itself, according to du Châtelet? Experience, writes du Châtelet, I quote, teaches us about the physical characteristics of things. It is then for our reason, raison, to use this knowledge about the physical characteristics of things, and I quote, and to deduce from it new knowledge and new enlightenment, end of quote. What underlies the fact that du Châtelet embraces experience as knowledge is the fundamental premise that observation through our senses provides us with truth. Du Châtelet namely claims that observations confirm or contest hypotheses in paragraph 58, 64, and 71, and that anything abstract, like the ideas of space and time, for example, cannot subsist without the concrete, real existing beings, for example, in paragraph 87. We may say, for example, that I do not know what it is that has caused the disarray in my office unless I have actually been there and have witnessed how the wind blew the window open and caused the paperwork to be blown through the room. If I was there to observe what happened, I can be said to be mad if I wasn't certain as to what the cause for the resulting disarray was. And I think it is in this sense that du Châtelet asserts that experience provides certainty in human knowledge. Du Châtelet specifically claims that knowledge is rooted in experience, just as it is rooted in a priori principles. It is this knowledge, that our knowledge is rooted in experience, metaphysical knowledge to du Châtelet? Du Châtelet's frequent use of phrases like, if we consider the beings which surround us in the 3rd chapter, as well as her notion that in a system of metaphysics, we would, beginning of quote, with the aid of certain givens, arrive at knowledge of unknowns, end of quote, indicates that du Châtelet indeed takes sense experience to be a condition of knowledge and as a content of metaphysical knowledge. When du Châtelet writes that experience in itself, I quote, includes nothing false or chimerical, end of quote, it is clear to her that observation and experience are one of the two sources of certain knowledge and truth, the other being the first principles. Paganini confirms in the context of his analysis of her theory of hypotheses, I quote, the institution openly acknowledged that sensible experience is necessary in order to achieve knowledge, end of quote. So I'm coming to the 4th section, certainty and uncertainty in knowledge that is based on experience. So just as knowledge that is based on the principles of knowledge is not in the same way certain as knowledge of the principles itself, knowledge that is based on observation and experience is not in the same way certain as observation and experience itself, according to du Châtelet. In the chapter on hypotheses, du Châtelet writes, I quote, one experience is not enough for a hypothesis to be accepted, but a single one suffices to reject it when it is contrary to it. Du Châtelet provides us with several reasons for why this is the case. One of them is that a hypothesis on the basis of an observation can still be mistaken about the cause which the observation is about. Another reason for why a hypothesis is not proven to be true by one experience alone is that a hypothesis can be true in one part, but false in another. While observation and experience thus in themselves are certain and contain nothing false or chimerical, a conclusion that is established on the basis of circumstantial and indirect observation and experience has the potential to be false. I know, for example, what the sufficient reason for the death of a person is if I saw this person being murdered. But if I did not see this, my conclusion about the true cause of the death of this person has the potential to be false. I can still establish a degree of certainty through my experience of circumstantial physical characteristics, like footprints, DNA traces, post-mortem examination, etc. And du Châtelet writes in this vein, so making hypotheses is allowed, and it is even very useful in all cases when we cannot discover the true reason for a phenomenon and the attendant circumstances, neither a priori by means of truth that we already know, nor a posteriori with the help of experiences. Du Châtelet's notion of probable knowledge, or a certainty of degree, is based on this theory about the certainty of observation and experience on the one hand, and the certainty of the principles of knowledge on the other. So I come to the fifth section, uncertain or probable knowledge. Du Châtelet develops a notion of a certainty of degree or of probability in the fourth chapter on hypotheses. In the first paragraph, she writes, I quote, "The true causes of natural effects and of the phenomena we observe are often so far from the principles on which we can rely and the experiences we can make that one is obliged to be content with probable reasons to explain them. Thus, probabilities are not to be rejected in the sciences, not only because they are often of great practical use, but also because they clear the path that leads to the truth. We can see here that uncertainty in our knowledge arises if this knowledge is far from the two stems of certainty. First, the principles, and second, experience. This uncertainty is given in human knowledge, i.e., being far away from being able to experience a cause or to deduce it directly on the basis of the first principles, as we heard in the preceding sections. We do not always know how a content or conclusion relates to the principles of knowledge, and we cannot always observe what the cause for a phenomenon or effect is. Hence, Detlefsen and Hutton also point out, with regard to discovering the true causes of natural effects and phenomena, we have to contend with uncertainty or probability in our knowledge. Paganini also writes accurately, I quote, "For her, a hypothesis is supposed to give reason, namely to explain the cause of the phenomena, at least in a provisional way, by waiting for a demonstration or an experimental confirmation," end of quote. A cause for Du Châtelet is such that it makes a natural phenomenon we observe explicable, as I point out in elsewhere, and as Émilie points out as well. If I cannot observe a cause, i.e. verify it through experience, I can establish a hypothesis about a probable cause. Ptolemy's hypothesis, for example, i.e. the hypothesis that the sun circles around the earth, was a good hypothesis because it explained the observable phenomenon of day and night, as well as the change of the celestial bodies which we can observe. Now, because certain observations, such as the difference in the length of night and day during the year, were not explicable on the basis of this hypothesis, a new and better hypothesis had to be advanced. This hypothesis had to establish a cause which made all observable phenomena explicable. Copernicus' hypothesis that the Earth circles around the sun did just that. It suggested a different cause which made observable phenomena in astronomy explicable. The question is now, can a conclusion which suggests a cause for phenomena or natural effects with probability, i.e. a hypothesis, ever become certain? And is the human being's knowledge of the true causes of phenomena and natural effects only ever probable, or can we know them with certainty? As Detlefsen notes, the line between the highest probability and certainty in Du Châtelet is slim, if not ambiguous. Detlefsen suggests that Du Châtelet, while embracing the category of the probable in the sciences, ultimately sticks to her initial distinction between truth and probability. In Paganini, the ambiguity in Du Châtelet herself is weighed towards the other direction. He writes, I quote, "Du Châtelet believed that it would be possible to increase the probability of a hypothesis with repeated positive tests until the highest level that induces our assent was reached, this being equivalent to moral certainty. This highest level of probability practically comes down to truth. Les hypotheses deviennent enfin des vérités," Du Châtelet says, as happened with Copernicus regarding the heliocentric system and with Huygens, who discovered the ring of Saturn, thus verifying his hypothesis. Probability and truth, Paganini suggests here, ultimately and practically become the same for Du Châtelet. Du Châtelet repeatedly distinguishes between truth and probability and suggests that both exist in our knowledge. She compares hypotheses to a scaffolding, which, when the building is complete, become useless, thereby indicating that hypotheses are only a path to the truth and not true themselves. Even stronger, she warns that, I quote, hypotheses become the poison of philosophy when they are made to pass for the truth, end of quote, as Detlefsen highlights. And Du Châtelet also compares hypotheses to a path which leads to a certain aim, and wherein the aim is the true cause. Hypotheses, then, are a means to find the truth, not the truth itself. While hypotheses are probable, the truth is certain. However, there's at least one passage, the one both Detlefsen and Paganini quote, where things appear to be more complicated. I quote, hypotheses, then, are only probable propositions that have a greater or lesser degree of certainty depending on whether they satisfy a more or less great number of circumstances attendant upon the phenomenon that one wants to explain by their means. And as a very great degree of probability gains our assent and has on us almost the same effect as certainty, hypotheses finally become truths for us when their probability increases to such a point that they can morally pass for a certainty. This is what happened with Copernicus' system of the world and with Mr. Huygens on the ring of Saturn, end of quote. Here, it looks as if the conclusions about the causes of natural effects and phenomena, which are commonly presented as truths, like the Copernican astronomical system, are in fact not certain and only ever highly probable. In turn, this passage suggests that a highly probable hypothesis is the truth with respect to the cause of phenomena and natural effects. This is prima facie in contradiction with Du Châtelet's distinction between hypotheses and truths above. So I think the solution to the ambiguity is rooted in the certainty that is achieved through experience in Du Châtelet. Let us turn back to Du Châtelet's justification of hypotheses at the beginning of the chapter. She writes, I quote, "Thus philosophers frame hypotheses to explain the phenomena, the cause of which cannot be discovered either by experience or by demonstration. We can see here that the true causes of phenomena and natural effects can be known with certainty if they can be demonstrated on the basis of the first principles and if they can be experienced. I can, for example, know that a thorn was the cause of the puncture in my bike if I see it stuck in the wheel. Hypotheses in the science of physics can in principle be turned into truths, i.e. certainties, if they can be verified by experience in the same way. However, in many cases in physics, this is practically impossible. I cannot simply see the Earth circling around the sun, at least not at Copernicus' time. Hence, the conclusion that the Earth circles around the sun is certain insofar as all observations and experiences concur with it, but it is hypothetical insofar as the conclusion is far away from an actual experience I make. Du Châtelet writes, I quote, "Experience is the cane that nature gave us blind ones," end of quote. But she also writes, beginning of quote, "We can never in our experiences arrive at the first elements which compose bodies," end of quote. Hence, experience is a source of certainty, and the problem we have in the science of physics is that certain objects of our inquiry, for example, the elements which compose bodies, are not objects of direct sensory experience, like Copernicus' hypotheses, or not even objects of possible experience, like the hypothesis about the non-extended elements of bodies. Physics, for the most part, thus remains in the realm of the probable and hypothetical, guided by experience on the one hand and by the principles of knowledge on the other. The principles and experience are the only two factors of certainty which determine the degree of probability and improbability. So my conclusion. I have argued that there are two objects of certain metaphysical knowledge in Du Châtelet. The first is that all our knowledge is founded on universal principles, and the second is that knowledge is founded on experience. Knowledge that is based on the a priori principles and knowledge that is based on a posteriori experience attains its validity through recourse to the principles and to experience, but does not inherit the same certainty as metaphysical knowledge of these sources of knowledge itself. Both together, the universal principles and experience are the guiding criteria to heighten the probability of hypotheses about the causes of phenomena and of natural effects in physics, which need to be advanced whenever these causes are not directly demonstrable through the principles or observed in experience. Du Châtelet's outspoken unwillingness to commit herself to one side of a scientific debate, over and above the need to think for yourself, is most evidently voiced with a view to physics and the often ferocious debate between mechanistic and mathematic methods, which had erupted amongst the Cartesians and the Newtonians. However, Du Châtelet's refusal to commit to partisanship and her quest to think for herself can equally be applied to a dispute between Lockean empiricism and Cartesian Leibnizian rationalism. Wolff is maybe closest to Du Châtelet's affirmation of a priori principles and experience as equal and primary roots of certainty in human knowledge when he writes, I quote, "We have then two ways by which we can reach the knowledge of truth, experience, and reason. The former is based on the senses and the latter on the understanding," end of quote. However, Wolff also says that experience is opposed to reason and that experience is based on the senses and reason on the understanding. Du Châtelet does not agree with this strict distinction between experience and reason, for she writes that, I quote, "It is experience that teaches us about the physical characteristics of things, and it is for our reason to use it and to deduce from it new knowledge and new enlightenment," end of quote. At any rate, Du Châtelet embraced Locke's view that experience gives us knowledge, but does not share his rejection of a priori principles. She embraced Descartes' view that we have to reason on the basis of incontestable principles, but rejected his view that there is not one belief based on the senses about which, I quote, "a doubt may not properly be raised," end of quote, and that, I quote, "even bodies are not strictly perceived by the senses or the imagination, but by the intellect alone," end of quote. Immediately after Du Châtelet brings experience and reason together as two sources of certainty and knowledge, she writes, I quote, "If I thought it incumbent upon me to caution you against the spirit of partisanship, I believe it even more necessary to advise you not to carry respect for the greatest men to the point of idolatry, as the majority of their disciples do. Each philosopher has seen something, and none has seen all. No book is so bad that nothing can be learned from it, and no book is so good that one might not improve it. The person who is endowed with reason must take nobody at his word alone, but must always make their own examination, setting aside the considerations always allotted to a famous name." Du Châtelet, as we can see in this passage, knew very well that her thoughts were her own, and that they could not be ascribed to the thoughts in the name of Newton or Descartes, of Leibniz or Wolff, of Locke or of Locke. It is only now that we can allot these considerations, which bridge some of the deepest rifts of the early modern period, to the famous name they belong to, Émilie du Châtelet. Thank you.